Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. Few peoples in the Bible carry a story as filled with contradictions as the Moabites. They were neighbors of Israel, yet also constant enemies. They were distant relatives, yet also a persistent source of spiritual stumbling. Always on the margins, always in conflict, and yet always present. But to truly understand who the Moabites were, we must go back to the beginning. And that beginning is anything but glorious. It does not involve heroes or great achievements. In fact, it all begins with ruins, smoke, and shame. The story of this people rises from the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah in an isolated cave marked by fear, despair, and a sin that would echo through generations. There, with Lot and his daughters, a stained lineage was born, a people who would carry in their very DNA the sorrow of a dark new beginning. This troubled origin shaped the identity of the Moabites, their tense relationship with Israel, and, according to the law of Moses itself, their exclusion from the people of God. They were, quite literally, forbidden to belong. And then, something unexpected happens. A Moabite woman, a foreigner, unlikely, excluded, breaks through every barrier. She is not only accepted, she becomes an essential part of King David's lineage. And more than that, she is written into the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. How is that possible? How can someone from a rejected people become a symbol of redemption? Today, we will dive into this fascinating journey, from the twisted first steps to the role the Moabites play in the eternal plan of God. Get ready to discover that even when all seems lost, the grace of God still writes new stories, with twists no one could foresee. After fleeing the terrifying destruction of Sodom, a city drenched in depravity and judged with fire from heaven, Lot and his two daughters found temporary refuge in the small town of Zoar. But even there, fear clung to them. The sounds of screams, the smell of smoke, and the memory of the flames still echoed in their minds like a living nightmare. Feeling unsafe and vulnerable, they chose to leave Zoar behind and retreat into the mountains, where they hid inside a lonely cave. Now completely cut off from civilization, surrounded only by rocks and silence, they faced a grim new reality. They were alone in the world. They had lost everything: the city they once called home, the fiancés of the daughters, their possessions, and most devastating of all, Lot's wife, who had been turned into a pillar of salt for looking back at the condemned past they were leaving behind. It was in this desolate setting, wrapped in uncertainty and marked by grief and trauma, that a deeply disturbing event took place. Lot's daughters, shaped by the moral decay they had witnessed throughout their lives in Sodom, began to see the world through distorted lenses. Hope seemed extinguished, and the fear that their lineage would disappear spoke louder than any principle. In chapter 19 of the book of Genesis, Scripture reveals the thoughts of the eldest daughter with unsettling clarity. Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the seed of our father. To their minds, already conditioned by a world where right and wrong were constantly blurred, this seemed like the only way to ensure the survival of their family line. They sincerely believed the world had ended, that no men were left, and that it was their duty to preserve Lot's seed at any cost. And so, on 2 consecutive nights, they gave their father wine until he was completely unaware of his surroundings. Then, one after the other, they lay with him. Lot, intoxicated and oblivious to what was happening, had no awareness of his actions, yet he became the father of his own grandchildren. The result of this incestuous union was 2 boys whose names would forever carry the weight of that act. The older daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger daughter also had a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites. Genesis 19:37-38. Unlike Israel, whose origin is interwoven with divine promises and a sacred covenant made with Abraham, the Moabites were born out of sin, pain, and despair. Their story did not begin with blessing, but with shame. And this beginning, far from being a mere disgraceful detail of the past, would shape how they were viewed and how they would relate to other nations, especially to their Israelite relatives. Over time, the descendants of Moab organized themselves, grew in number, and became an established people. Thus arose the nation of the Moabites, marked from its birth by an ancestral stigma, destined to play a central role in conflicts, unexpected alliances, and events that would echo for centuries in biblical history. After years of wandering through the wilderness, facing hunger, thirst, war, and hardship, the Israelites finally arrived at the edge of the Promised Land. It was the moment for which generations had longed. But upon reaching the borders of Canaan, they encountered a people who, despite being blood relatives, did not greet them with hospitality. On the contrary, the Moabites, their distant kin, reacted with suspicion, fear, and hostility. The Moabite response was not merely defensive, it was offensive, strategic, and profoundly dangerous. The Bible reveals that they tried to destroy Israel in two very different but equally deadly ways. First, through spiritual attack, and second, through moral seduction. The first attempt is described in Numbers chapters 22 to 24. Balak, king of Moab, looked out over the vast Israelite camp spread across the plains, like a tidal wave about to crash upon his kingdom. Fear gripped him. He saw no possibility of winning in direct combat. The Israelites were too numerous, and tales of their earlier victories had already spread throughout the region. So Balak chose an unconventional approach. He turned to the supernatural. Instead of swords, he sought cursed words. He summoned a well-known prophet, Balaam, a respected seer whose enchantments were considered powerful, and offered him great wealth in exchange for a curse upon Israel. But Balaam, in trying to fulfill the king's wish, encountered an immovable obstacle, the very God of Israel. On his way to meet Balak, he was stopped by a surreal scene. His donkey, seeing an angel blocking the path, refused to go forward, and then, miraculously, the donkey spoke to its master. That's right, a donkey that spoke like a human being, warning Balaam of the danger ahead. This remarkable episode reveals something crucial. God was in complete control. No scheme, no curse, no hidden plot could escape his notice. Balak took Balaam to 3 different locations, high places with a clear view of the Israelite camp. At each one, he hoped to hear words of destruction. But every time Balaam opened his mouth, only blessings came out. He could not curse the chosen people. Instead, he pronounced prophecies of victory, greatness, and divine favor upon Israel. It was a humiliation for Balak, and a powerful demonstration that the plans of God cannot be undone by human hands. But the problem was not yet over. Faced with the failure of cursing, a new strategy was suggested, and this one was far more insidious. According to later biblical accounts, it was Balaam himself who advised the king of Moab with an alternative plan. If they could not defeat Israel with force or spells, they could lead them into ruin through temptation. Thus began the second offensive. The Moabite women, known for their beauty and alluring customs, approached the men of Israel. They invited them to feasts, rituals, and religious celebrations. And the Israelite men, weary and vulnerable after years of wandering, gave in. Numbers chapter 25 describes this moment with stark clarity. The Israelites began to prostitute themselves with the Moabite women, to eat of the sacrifices offered to their gods, and eventually to bow before Baal of Peor, a pagan deity. It was a spiritual collapse. The nation that had been set apart by God, instructed not to mingle with idolatrous peoples, fell into a deadly trap. God's response was immediate and severe. His wrath burned against the people, and a plague began sweeping through the camp. Thousands died. It was as if the holiness of the nation had been shattered, a covenant betrayed by lust and idolatry. In the midst of the chaos, a priest rose up. Phinehas, filled with a burning zeal, took radical action. He purified the camp with decisive deeds, putting an end to the desecration. Only then did the plague cease. But this episode was not merely a dark chapter from the past. It revealed a profound truth. Israel's greatest enemy was not always on the outside, with spears and shields. Often it came disguised as pleasure, cloaked in seduction, and hidden beneath cultural practices. Because of this, the Moabites became more than just a military threat. They became a symbol of spiritual danger, a people whose influence could draw Israel away from their God and lead them to the brink of destruction. And in response to this hidden hostility and spiritual offense, something extremely serious was decreed. The actions of the Moabites, from the attempt to curse Israel to their success in spiritually corrupting them at Baal Peor, did not go unnoticed by God. These were not just emotional scars in Israel's memory, they became law, a spiritual and legal landmark that established a clear, powerful, and enduring boundary between Moab and the covenant people. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 3, God delivers a direct and weighty command through Moses. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Harsh words, unyielding. Shall not enter the assembly of the Lord was not just a ritual restriction or social limitation. It was a total exclusion from the heart of Israel's spiritual and communal life. It meant not belonging, not being part of the people, not participating in the promised blessing. And as if that were not enough, God adds, even to the 10th generation, forever. This is more than a temporary punishment. It is a perpetual separation, a decree that echoes across generations. The next verse explains the reason for this severity. Because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired Balaam to curse you. God did not forget the Moabites' coldness in the face of Israel's suffering, nor their treacherous plan to use spiritual forces to destroy a people freshly delivered from slavery. It was more than ingratitude, it was a calculated act of spiritual sabotage. At first glance, this prohibition may seem extreme, but seen through the lens of faith, it was not driven by divine vengeance or hatred. It was an act of preservation, a protective barrier. Israel was a holy nation, set apart, and any influence that could lead them astray had to be kept at a distance. God was guarding the heart of the covenant. In this way, the fate of the Moabites seemed sealed. A people with origins steeped in sin, a history of betrayal, and now an eternal decree of exclusion. To human eyes, this was the end of the road. The door to God was shut. Reconciliation seemed impossible. But God is never limited by appearances. His justice is real, but His mercy is even deeper. He writes stories of redemption where the world sees only rejection, and it is precisely within this dark and seemingly hopeless backdrop that He plants a seed of hope, a story that would blossom against all odds. Centuries later, during one of the most chaotic and spiritually confused periods in Israel's history, the time of the Judges, a narrative emerges that challenges the very logic of exclusion, a story of love, loyalty, and redemption. And its central figure is not an Israelite. She is a woman, a widow, a foreigner, and a Moabite. Her name was Ruth. The book of Ruth begins with profound irony. Famine strikes Bethlehem, a town whose name literally means house of bread, forcing an Israelite family to seek refuge in none other than the land of Moab, the forbidden land, the cursed land. The head of this family was Elimelech. He, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons left in search of sustenance. But in Moabite territory, they found more than just food. They found the unexpected, human connection, and also deep sorrow. The 2 sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But soon after, tragedy struck. Elimelech died. And not long after, both sons also passed away. 3 widows, alone in a foreign land. The future seemed lost. Naomi, now aged and heartbroken, decided to return to Bethlehem. She had heard that the Lord had visited His people and that bread had returned to the house of bread. Before leaving, however, she did something noble and moving. She released her daughters-in-law. She urged them to return to their families, to remarry and rebuild their lives. It was a true act of love. Naomi wanted the best for them, even if it meant walking alone. Orpah, with tears in her eyes, accepted. She kissed Naomi and returned. A human and understandable choice. But Ruth chose a different path, a path that would change the course of history. She refused to leave Naomi, refused to turn back, and with words that echo through the ages as one of the most powerful declarations of loyalty and love ever spoken, she said, and that is exactly what we read in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. One of the most touching and profound statements in all of Scripture. Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me ever so severely if anything but death separates me from you. These words are more than an affectionate gesture from a faithful daughter-in-law. They are a covenant, a radical and transformative decision. Ruth was renouncing her homeland, her cultural identity, her past, and more than that, the gods she had once worshipped. She gave it all up to follow Naomi, and above all, to follow the God of Israel. It was a true and profound conversion, not born of compulsion, but of love. Of the silent witness of Naomi's life, of a faith that bloomed in the soil of tragedy. Ruth didn't just choose to follow her mother-in-law, she chose to belong. She chose to love a people who, according to the law, had rejected her. And she chose to trust a God who, though he may have seemed distant in the midst of suffering, was still worthy of total surrender. With that decision, Ruth, the Moabite, the one excluded by law, took a step that united her to the covenant people not by blood, but by faith, a faith that God would surely not ignore. And so, two widows, one an Israelite marked by loss, the other a Moabite full of courage and conviction, walked side by side back to Bethlehem, not knowing what awaited them, with no promises, only sustained by hope and loyalty. But in that simple act of faithfulness, God was already writing a new page in the story of salvation. Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem raises a question that cannot be overlooked. How could a Moabite, someone explicitly excluded by the law, be welcomed among the people of Israel? And more than that, become the protagonist of a story celebrated in Scripture? The answer is both unsettling and wondrous. Grace, the law of Deuteronomy, was a necessary boundary, a protective fence against the destructive influence of an idolatrous culture. But it was never intended to be an eternal seal of personal condemnation. The God of the Bible has always been, from the very beginning, a God who looks at the heart. And Ruth's heart was not like that of her ancestors. Hers was a heart transformed, surrendered, and sincere. When Ruth declared, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God," she wasn't merely making a promise. She was converting. She was entering by faith into the covenant that defined Israel. And God received her. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, her humility, her hard work, and her unwavering loyalty caught the attention of a man named Boaz. He was a close relative of Naomi, and according to Israelite tradition, there was someone who held a sacred role in such situations, the Goel, or kinsman redeemer. This figure had a holy responsibility to protect the family in times of crisis, to redeem lost land, and to restore the name of a deceased relative by marrying his widow. Boaz saw Ruth, but not merely with physical eyes. He saw her faith, her courage, her dignity, and he chose to act as her redeemer. He married her, taking on not only the responsibility, but also the privilege of restoring the name and hope of Naomi's family. And with that act, the story took an extraordinary turn. Ruth, the foreigner, became a legitimate and honored part of the people of Israel. This story is more than a beautiful account of love. It is a living parable. Ruth represents all of us, outsiders, Gentiles, flawed people with no spiritual inheritance, marked by pasts far from God. And Boaz represents Christ, the Redeemer, who sees us, chooses us, rescues us, and unites us to himself through an eternal covenant of love and redemption. Just as Ruth was brought into God's family, we too are welcomed, not by merit, but by grace. A grace that surpasses laws, tears down walls, and writes a new story where there was once only rejection. The final and most astonishing proof of Ruth's importance is not found only in the Old Testament. It echoes across the centuries and reappears at the very beginning of the New Testament, when the Gospel of Matthew opens with something that might seem dry at first glance, a genealogy. But there, in the carefully recorded lineage of the Messiah, among patriarchs, judges, and kings, we find something unexpected: the names of 4 women. Women who, in their own time and place, defied expectations. And one of them is Ruth. Yes, Ruth, the Moabite. This detail is not a coincidence. In a patriarchal and exclusive culture, mentioning the name of any woman in a genealogy was already uncommon. But mentioning a foreign woman from a people once forbidden is a theological statement, a powerful declaration. God's plan of salvation was never limited to just one nation. It was always universal. It always included the unlikely. Ruth's faith, born in tragedy, expressed in loyalty, and lived out in humility, was so profound that God not only welcomed her, He placed her at the center of the redemption story. Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David, and from David's line came Jesus Christ. It is as if God was saying, "Yes, I know her past. Yes, I know the origin of her people. But more than that, I know the heart that believes." The story that began in shame, despair, and rejection ends in glory, redemption, and belonging. Grace won, mercy won, love won. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the story of the Moabites, a story that begins in a cave under the weight of sin and sorrow and ends in heaven, with the birth of the one who would save all of humanity. We've looked back on a nation born in darkness, that grew in pride, that tried to seduce and curse the people of God, and was therefore cast out by a harsh and unyielding law. But in the midst of that broken lineage, God chose a woman, not a queen, not a prophetess, but a widow, poor, foreign, and invisible in the eyes of the world, to show that the past does not define the future when God steps in. The story of Ruth offers us the most beautiful of all truths. The grace of God is greater than any curse, greater than any law, greater than any rejection. The sin committed in the darkness of a cave seemed to have sealed Moab's fate forever. But in a barley field, under the morning sun, a foreign woman gathered more than grain. She gathered redemption, and in doing so, she sowed the path that generations later would bring into the world the true light, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer. The law of God is holy, just, and perfect. It reveals His character, His standard of holiness, and it soberly reminds us of the consequences of sin. But the story of Ruth reveals something even deeper. God's heart is always drawn toward those who come to Him with humility and sincere faith. Ruth shows us that God doesn't merely see flags, ethnicities, or family histories. He sees hearts. And when a heart turns to Him, repentant and true, no curse, no exclusion, no barrier is strong enough to stop His grace from reaching and transforming it. This story teaches us that God does not judge nations as faceless masses, but sees each individual. His mercy is personal, and it is always available to anyone who truly seeks Him, no matter where they come from or what their past may be. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey, one that reveals how even a story marked by shame can become a vessel of redemption. The Moabite legacy, which began in darkness, found its light through the faith of a single woman, and through her, God revealed His greater plan of salvation. If you'd like to continue exploring stories like this, filled with twists, hope, and forgotten truths of Scripture, I invite you now to click on one of the 2 videos on your screen. Each one holds a new journey that will stir your heart and deepen your faith. May God bless your life, and we'll see you soon.